The Vicksburg Campaign, Chapter 4, West to Vicksburg. At the end of Chapter 3, Grant's Union Army with about 40,000 men has turned west from Jackson toward Vicksburg. General John Pemberton's Confederate Army with about 32,000 men is moving east from Vicksburg, so it looks like the two armies will collide. Pemberton's army started their move on May 15. The plan was to march east to Edwards, turn southeast onto the Raymond Road, and then south toward Dillon to attack the Union supply line. Warren Grabow, in his book 98 Days, writes that the total distance was 10 miles, and Pemberton planned on making the march in one day. Pemberton's army was organized into 3 divisions: Stevenson's, Loring's, and Bowen's. But Pemberton's army got a late start on the 15th, and rains slowed travel on the dirt roads, and then a washed-out bridge forced them to detour north. By the end of the day, they were east of Edwards Station near Champion Hill, exhausted and out of time, and they bedded down for the night. Pemberton's cavalry patrols had been fired on by Union pickets to the east, and General Bowen saw the glow of campfires reflecting off clouds to the east. But apparently Pemberton did not expect to be attacked in the morning, and no alarms were raised. The Confederate army settled down for the night on a line running northeast to southwest, about here. Their wagon train was on the Jackson Road just to the west. As far as I know, no one was thinking about lines of retreat, but Baker's Creek to the west is flooded and is a major obstacle right now, especially for the Army's wagons. Bridges are needed, and there are 2, one north and one south, here. The one to the south is washed out, so the route west on Jackson Road is very important if the Army suddenly needs to retreat. And the plan for the next day is to move south toward Dillon, where they expect to attack the Union supply line. And what did Grant and Pemberton know? Apparently, General Pemberton knew on the morning of the 16th that a Union force was close, but he assumed it was a rear guard of Grant's army. General Grant positioned his army on the night of the 15th, expecting to attack the Confederate army in the morning, and Grabow writes that Grant received intelligence that morning that told him Pemberton's approximate location, and he understood that the 7 divisions he had with him, quote, substantially outnumbered the rebel force, unquote. The Union Army is positioned along the 3 east-west roads, 3 divisions on the Jackson Road to the north, 2 divisions on the Middle Road, and 2 divisions on the Raymond Road in the south, and that's 7 divisions. So where are the other 3? Sherman's Corps was less than a day's march away with 2 divisions in Jackson, and then MacArthur's division from McPherson's Corps is about a day away to the southwest at Cayuga. Grant ordered the units on the 3 roads forward. They all started on time, but they were instructed to not bring on an engagement unless they were certain of success. In the north, the Confederate left flank, Hovey's Union division was in contact almost immediately. Both sides were surprised and struggled to deploy. Apparently, General Hovey felt he had the advantage of tactical surprise and messaged his corps commander, General McClernand, asking for permission to attack. And apparently McClernand then forwarded the message to Grant, asking for permission to attack. And apparently that message and Grant's response took hours for couriers to deliver. But look where Hovey is positioned, up on the Confederate left with 2 of McPherson's divisions. Grant and McPherson were there together that morning, and the attack was pushed forward on the Union right. Osterhaus on the Middle Road and Smith on the Raymond Road on the center and left also attacked, but their attacks all stall, and McClernand does not push forward. A U.S. Army training document on the Vicksburg campaign summarized what happened. Pemberton's first reaction was to order his army to reverse course and withdraw toward Edwards. The wagon train was turned around and headed back, when Pemberton's subordinates persuaded him that it was too late to leave. Reluctantly, Pemberton ordered his army to form for battle." Unquote. The Union attack on the north starts to roll up the Confederate left flank and pushes across the crossroads here, which threatens to cut off Stevenson's division from Loring's and Bowen's divisions. Eventually, first Bowen's and then Loring's divisions counterattacked to the north. The attacks by Bowen's division had dramatic success, but they were not supported, and eventually they ran out of ammunition. Late in the day, Pemberton learns that the southern crossing over Baker Creek is open after all, and they begin to retreat west towards the Big Black River Bridge. General Loring's division is cut off and ends up retreating southeast, and after a couple days, Loring joined up with General Johnston north of the state capital at Jackson. The other two divisions, Bowen's and Stevenson's, retreat west towards Vicksburg. General Pemberton gets his army and their equipment away and across the Big Black River, but his army is defeated, discouraged, and disorganized. They need time to rest and recover. The only combat-ready units he has left on the night after the battle are Bowen's division plus an additional brigade. General Grant's priority now is to force a crossing of the Big Black River. General Johnston's army is still in his rear, and Grant was concerned about being trapped against the Big Black River between Johnston and Pemberton's forces. He wanted to regain contact with the Navy and his supply line on the river, because, as Grabow wrote, that long wagon road back to Grand Gulf simply could not be defended. Unquote. If Johnston moved quickly from his position north of Jackson, he could break the supply line south of Edwards. Or Pemberton could cross the Big Black River at Hankinson's Ferry and break the supply line at Willow Springs or Rocky Springs. Grant ordered Sherman to bring his corps west from Jackson, and he sent McClernand's corps forward to force a crossing at the Big Black River Bridge. Pemberton agonized about how and how long to defend the crossing at the Big Black River. His army was wrecked, and there were multiple crossings to defend, and he also agonized about whether to defend Vicksburg or to retreat to the north. According to Grabow, from Pemberton's point of view, military wisdom demanded that the army be saved. Unquote. It would be relatively easy to retreat north to Yazoo City and then join with General Johnston's force, but Pemberton had clear orders from President Davis to defend Vicksburg at all costs. If Grant once captured Vicksburg, because of the U.S. Navy control of the river, the Confederacy would never be able to put the city under siege and then win it back. As Grabow summarized it, the only practical decision was to hold Vicksburg at all costs and to depend on Johnston and the Confederacy to break the inevitable siege. Unquote. Timothy Smith, in an essay covering the battle in the book The Vicksburg Campaign, wrote that Confederate forces at the Big Black Bridge totaled between 4,000 and 5,000. Donald Miller, in his book Vicksburg, Grant's Campaign That Broke the Confederacy, says it was 4,000 men on the Confederate side. I'm estimating U.S. forces at 11,583, which is the total listed in the official records for Carr's division plus Osterhaus's division plus Burbridge's brigade from Smith's division. Bowen's division with 5,000 men arrived in the bridgehead at the Big Black River Bridge about midnight on the 16th, and General Bowen took over defense of the crossing. See this map from the atlas that's part of the official records showing the battlefield at the Big Black River. The river runs in a loop from northeast to southwest. The railroad and the highway run east to west, and the river crossing is here. At the crossing, there was a railroad bridge, and a small steamboat, the Dot, was moored crosswise just below the bridge with planking across the top to make a second floating bridge. Bowen's orders were to hold the crossing until Loring's division had crossed. Bowen and Pemberton didn't know that Loring's division wasn't coming. Loring's division was marching south. They would circle around to the east and join Johnston's force. Carr's Union division, chasing Pemberton's army, arrived at the bridgehead at dawn on the 17th. Osterhaus's division joined soon, and then while McClernand formed the two divisions to assault Bowen's position, the scouts for the brigade on the Union right, Lawler's brigade, found a meander scar, a trough formed by an old channel of the river. This trough gave a sheltered approach right up to the Confederate left flank. General Lawler asked for permission to make an attack and was told to go ahead. Lawler's brigade had worked in so close that the Confederate defenders only had time to fire a single volley before a Union bayonet charge was across the moat and the parapet. Lawler's charge was followed by the rest of Carr's division, and then Osterhaus's division joined in. The Confederate defense at the Big Black collapsed, and the defenders fled across the river. As the Union men approached the riverbank, the railroad bridge and the steamer Dot were burned. If you've seen Chapter 2 in this series of videos, you might remember that Grant's boss back in D.C., General Halleck, wanted him to suspend operations and move south to reinforce General Banks at Port Hudson. Grant was no fan of General Halleck, and in what seems an act of insubordination, was hoping that he could use the time lag in communications between rural Mississippi and the capital at Washington, D.C., to move his campaign far enough along that by the time Halleck caught up with him, it would be too late to undo his actions. Grant's calculation was that he had 8 days, and the 8 days expired on May 11. Today's May 17. So as Grant tells the story in his memoirs, he was watching the battle at the Big Black River Bridge as Brigadier General Lawler prepared his attack. An officer from Banks's staff came up and presented me with a letter from General Halleck, dated the 11th of May. It had been sent by the way of New Orleans to Banks to be forwarded to me. It ordered me to return to Grand Gulf and to cooperate from there with Banks against Port Hudson, and then to return with our combined forces to besiege Vicksburg. I told the officer that the order came too late, and that Halleck would not give it now if he knew our position. The bearer of the dispatch insisted that I ought to obey the order, and was giving arguments to support his position, when I heard great cheering to the right of our line, and looking in that direction, saw Lawler in his shirt sleeves, leading a charge upon the enemy. I immediately mounted my horse and rode in the direction of the charge, and saw no more of the officer who delivered the dispatch. I think not even to this day." Unquote. You may doubt Grant's story. It's too good to be true, almost too good. The name of Banks's staff officer is recorded in Donald Miller's book. The staff officer's name is Brigadier General William Dwight. And it seems that earlier he was a brigade commander in Banks's army, and you can look him up on Wikipedia. Brigadier General William Dwight. So here's the situation on the night following the Battle of the Big Black River Bridge, May 17. Pemberton has 2 fresh garrison divisions, Forney's and Smith's, waiting in Vicksburg. Bowen's and Stevenson's divisions, following the defeat at Champion Hill on the Big Black River Bridge, are retreating here on the road between the Big Black and Vicksburg. Loring's division is off the map to the southeast, on their way to join up with General Johnston's forces. McClernand's corps, after the battle at the Big Black River Bridge, are at the crossing, while his engineers build replacement bridges. McPherson's corps is upstream around Amsterdam, building their own bridges, and Sherman's corps is further upstream at Bridgeport, and they've already built a new bridge across the river. Steele's and Blair's divisions from Sherman's corps crossed on the night of the 17th. Tuttle's division crossed the next morning. Pemberton's troops from the route at the Big Black River Bridge began trickling into Vicksburg at dusk on the 17th, and by morning on the 19th, the fortifications in the city were manned and ready for action. All three Union corps were across the Big Black River by the morning of the 18th. Sherman's corps pushed ahead on the right, and at about 5 p.m. on the 18th bumped up against the fortifications outside Vicksburg. According to Grabow, on the 18th, Admiral Porter's fleet deposited mountains of supplies plus horses and wagons at Mrs. Johnson's plantation on the Yazoo, and Sherman's engineers started plans for the necessary road improvements to move the supplies. This was a landmark moment. Grant had reconnected to the U.S. Navy Brownwater supply line down from Cairo and Memphis. The Yazoo depot was not an especially good solution for McClernand's corps, which was far away on the Union left flank. So in the next day or two, engineers created a separate depot serviced by the U.S. Navy at Warrenton. On the evening of the 18th, you can see Pemberton's 4 divisions inside the fortifications at Vicksburg. Sherman's corps is at the river north of the city. McPherson's corps is in the center at Bovina, and McClernand's corps is to the south. All 3 U.S. corps took up positions around the city on the morning of the 19th. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Grant ordered a more or less impromptu attack on the Confederate lines. The attack on the 19th failed. The Union troops made a second mass attack on the 22nd, which also failed. Grant's army was getting reinforcements from the 16th Corps up at Memphis and elsewhere, so that by the end of the siege on July 4, Grant's army numbered nearly 77,000. Pemberton couldn't get reinforcements, but Johnston's army was still out there. Grant defeated Johnston's army once at Jackson on May 14, but Johnston's force escaped and were now known as the Army of Relief. By June 4, the Army of Relief had grown to 32,000 men, and Johnston was under constant pressure to make a move to save Vicksburg. Grant worried they would attack his rear and help Pemberton's army break out to the north. Johnston procrastinated. Finally, on July 1, the Army of Relief began to move southwest from the area north of Bolton. On July 3, Johnston decided they would circle down through Edwards to Hankinson's Ferry and come north and strike Grant's army from the south. But on the afternoon of July 3, before they reached Edwards, they heard the roar of guns from Vicksburg stop. And then on the next morning, they heard rumors that Vicksburg had fallen. And Grabow writes that they got confirmation at dawn on July 5. It was too late for Johnston to save Vicksburg. Grant wanted the threat to his rear removed, and on June 22, General Sherman formed what was called the Army of Maneuver. On July 4, they moved east with 34,000 men, just barely larger than Johnston's Army of Relief with 32,000. Johnston's army was at Birdsong's Ferry and Edwards. Sherman chased Johnston into Jackson on July 10. Johnston withdrew out of Jackson on the 16th. Sherman occupied Jackson for the second time the next day, and he destroyed what was left of the city from the first occupation back on May 14, and evacuated back to the west on July 23. End of story. Ulysses Grant, of course, ended up getting promoted to commanding general of all U.S. Army forces, and General Halleck, his former boss, was his chief of staff. Grant was later elected to 2 terms as U.S. president and wrote a brilliant memoir of his life, and Grant died in 1885. John Pemberton ended up resigning his commission as general and was later appointed to be a lieutenant colonel in command of the artillery around Richmond. He was captured on April 12, 1865, and then returned to his farm in Pennsylvania. He died in 1881.